Good morning, students. This is Indian Economic Development, and here we will talk about Chapter 1, that is Indian Economy on the Eve of Independence. In the last class, we were able to discuss some points that what actually how India was in a very good condition before the British rule. There was better agriculture and good handicraft industry, developed handicrafts in the country. But then the Britishers came to India and they conquered the entire of India in the Battle of Plassey, which was fought in 1757. That is, you can say, the foundation of British Empire in India. Britishers, the basic purpose of the British rule to come to India was to use Indian economy as feeder economy for the development of British economy. So they actually used India very badly. They exploited the Indian economy and all its natural as well as human resources. For almost 200 years, there was British rule in India, and it really destroyed and exploited India to a greater extent. If we talk about the conditions of agriculture, there was a very low level of agriculture productivity at the time of independence. Reason being, the land settlement system, also known as zamindari system, which was started by the British rule. Under the system, the profits they were generally these all the profits they were taken from the cultivators by the zamindars, and they were submitted to the British government in the form of lagan. And this kind of system, it left with the agriculturist or cultivators to have very little grains left for their own survival. So they were demotivated, and this declined the agriculture productivity. Then, second point that is mentioned here, if you see, commercialization of agriculture. British, they've promoted the growth of cash crops over the food grains, because cash crops they were required for British industries as raw material. So they promoted the commercialization. Commercialization means when they wanted the cultivators, they make them produce cash crops instead of food grains. Did they do that? By by luring them for more money, that if you are going to produce cash crops, you will get higher prices for that. Then the other reason for the setback of agriculture or fallback of agriculture was dependence on monsoon. Still we are dependent on monsoon for the agriculture, and during that time British government did no efforts to improve the agriculture productivity. So the agriculture was mainly dependent on monsoons. When there is good monsoon, there is good crop. When there is bad monsoon, the farmers suffer. No means of irrigation were there. Then the fourth point, lack of proper input. Input means there were no use of any kind of technology, there was no use of any kind of fertilizers, pesticides, better variety of seeds, anything like that was not given to the farmers for the betterment of agriculture. Last is the adverse effects of partition. Now, at the eve of independence, when there was a partition of the country, the major setback to the country was the rich and very fertile lands, they went to Pakistan. So basically, the major blow was when the jute producing areas, they also become a part of East Pakistan, now Bangladesh. So in this way we can say that agriculture, it became stationary kind, it became without any kind of growth during the long British rule. Then industrial sector. What was the situation of industrial sector at the time of independence? It is much dependent on the policies of the British during their rule on the country. So it would, the first point we would say deindustrialization or the decline of handicraft industries. If we see, when the Britishers came to India, there was no industry, although there was no industry in the form of modern industry, but we had handicrafts. We had a very good handicraft during that period of time. What the Britishers do? They did not actually develop it, they destroyed it, and they allowed no modern industry to come up. So, how did they do that? How did they followed that policy of deindustrialization? They actually introduced a very discriminatory tariff policy. In this policy, they allowed tariff-free export of raw materials from India and also tariff-free import of the finished products from the British industries in India. There was no tax, no tariff for the export and import of raw material to British industries and finished goods to the Indian market. But if we talk about the handicraft products, there was a huge duty imposed so as to discourage the export of handicrafts in the international market. In the international market, there was huge demand for Indian handicrafts. So when the Britishers put these huge taxes, it led to increase in its prices. So demand gradually declined in the international market. The second important point, due to the finished goods that were coming from Britain in Indian domestic market, it gave a very big competition to the Indian handicrafts because they were lower in cost, because they were industry made product, and they were very fine quality products. So the handicrafts could not compete it in the domestic market also. They were destroyed. Then new patterns of demand. There were people who were more interested to buy British products. They wanted to buy British products and giving more favor to them as compared to the Indian products. So this pattern of demand actually also destroyed the Indian handicraft industry. More markets for British goods. How there was increase in markets for the British goods? Because the Britishers used the transportation in the country. The railways were introduced by the Britishers themselves. The railways helped them to capture the markets, to supply their products in the different markets of the country very easily. And these railways also help them to get raw material for their industry. Railway was very important, that facilitated the Britishers to control the country also. With military, they can send to any place by using railways. So railway has been a remarkable in the history of British rule in India, because it really helped the Britishers to have a complete control over the country. And in case of industry also, it gave them an edge over the local producers. Next, point 5, lack of capital goods industries. Capital goods industries, the industries that are producing machinery which can be used to set up an industry to produce consumer goods. These are capital good industries. In India, there were hardly any capital good industry when the Britishers came, and they were not interested to develop such industries in India because they were promoting the industrialization in Britain only. They wanted India to to depend on the British industries for finished goods as well as whatever capital goods was required in the country. Last point. Sixth, limited role of the public sector. That is, we are talking about the limited role of the Britishers. They did no development in case of the industry. If you talk about industry, they were not ready to develop industries in the country. Whatever development they were doing, it was basically confined to railways, power generation, communication, ports, and other things. These all things were actually required by the British government themselves, so they can in a better way control the country. With the communication like post offices, they were able to know if there are any problems, turbulences in the country in the form of revolts in the country. They can use the railways to get their military over there. So they want to have a proper rule in which they were able to also use these communication modes, these transportation modes, so as to get the raw materials from the country to their British industries and to get the finished products in the Indian market. So whatever development, limited development they were doing, it was for the encouragement of British rule and for the exploitation of the Indian economy. Next, foreign trade. The trade policy which was made by the British in India, it was basically to convert India into the exporter of primary products and importer of the finished products. Primary products may, if you talk about silk, cotton, wool, sugar, I've given the examples here. And these raw materials were taken by the British industries from India and used to manufacture the finished goods like cotton, silk, woolen clothes, other etc. things that were again sold in the same Indian domestic market at a higher price. The raw materials, they were exported to British government by the British government to Britain at lower price, and finished products were sold in India at a much higher price. So this is also known as dual exploitation. Then the second point, composition of export import. Like if a country is exporting primary products and importing finished goods, it shows that it is a backward economy. So Indian economy was backward because it was exporting only primary products, importing finished goods, and mostly the export and imports were restricted to Britain. There was monopoly. Monopoly means complete control of Britain on India's foreign trade policy. Then, the last point tells us about the drain of Indian wealth. During the British rule, whatever exports surplus profit was there, they were exporting so much of raw material to Britain. So, whatever export surplus profits were there, it was actually used to bear the administrative expenses of the British government in India, firstly. And secondly, it was used to bear the war expenses, World War expenses of the Britain. This led to complete drain of Indian wealth during the British rule. So we talked about agriculture sector here. Then we talked about industrial sector. Then we talked about the foreign trade. Now we are going to start the demographic condition. Demography is what? When we are talking about the people of the country, we are actually interested to understand the population of the country in the parameters of their rate, death rate, literacy rate, health facilities. There can be so many parameters on the basis of which we talk about the people of a country. So, what was the health rate and death rate? They were both very high. Means both death rate and birth rate were very high during those periods of time. It means if we talk about the birth rate, it was 48 per thousand. And if we talk about the death rate, it was 40 per thousand. It means there was low survival. Low survival rate, as given here, 8 per thousand was only the survival rate, which was very, very low due to the extreme conditions of the country. Hope you must understand what is birth rate and death rate. Here we actually interested number of children born per thousand in a year. This is we are talk about birth rate, and number of people dying per thousand persons in a year, it is the death rate. Life expectancy, it is the overall, we are talking about the number of years, average number of years for which a people are expected to live. This is what is life expectancy. Like if an individual is there, he will live up to this age, particular age, then we say that it is the life expectancy, and it was 32 years. That's very low. So it was assumed if an adult is there or a child is born, he may live up to only 32 years of age. That is very less. For example, if you compare it with the present days, It's almost 65 years now that an individual is expected to live. Then, literacy rate. What was the education level in the country? It was also extremely poor. Overall literacy rate 16% here given. And if we talk about the female literacy, it was negligible during those periods of time. It was only 7%. So, this demographic condition, it actually talks about the characteristics of the population, their literacy we talked about, their life expectancy, her high birth rate and death rate we talked about. Here we can also talk about infant mortality rate. It was also very alarming during those times. Health facilities, if we talk about, they were very, very poor. They were not sufficient for the entire population. Very, very inadequate. So there were situations of pandemic over those periods. There were diseases which were widespread, not able to control due to that. Moving on to the occupational structure. We are aware that agriculture, before even the Britishers came to India, agriculture was the main source of occupation and livelihood for the people. During the British rule, it remains the same because no development in industries was made. In fact, it made worse. People who were dependent on handicrafts, they became unemployed. And this further deteriorated the condition and they were further dependent on the agriculture. So, agriculture was the major source of livelihood for the people. That is 72.7% is given, almost 75% of the population. Then, if we say the remaining portion, 10% and 17%, they were dependent on industries, you can say, little bit of industry, whatever it was left. And services, basically, the services were, there were people in the military, they were army of the British rule, the Indians who were employed as the administrative clerks in their offices. They comprises of the service sector during the British rule. So this was the condition of occupational structure. That was also very poor. If we talk about infrastructure during those periods of time, the whatever development the Britishers did, it was the transportation and communication. Transportation, we can say, the development of roads. The development of roads, they were basically to, they were interested to use the roads as for the interest of mobilizing the army and for shifting of raw materials. This was the main idea. But as far as the connection of road to the rural or far off areas was concerned, it was very acute shortage in that sense. The people living in such far off areas, they suffered badly because of scarcity of roads. Railways also were developed. They introduced the railways in 1850, and this was basically for the commercialization of Indian agriculture or for getting raw materials. They were developing railways in order to promote the foreign trade, specifically to Britain. So, the ports and other sea routes were also developed with the same motive. Now, if we talk about other developments like air water transport, the development was far from satisfactory. There were no inland waterways which were developed, and they were not even operational if it was developed. In the form of communication, if we talk about the communication, they developed the post and telegraphs. These were the most popular means, and they served the purpose of maintaining law and order in the country by the British. Although, if we talk about the postal services, they were somehow useful for public purpose, but it remained very inadequate. So, in communication, we are dealing with posts and telegraphs. There was also the development of electric telegraph, but it was so expensive and it was only to serve the British. So, here we come towards the end of the chapter. We discussed the important points. We talked about agriculture, industry, we talked about foreign trade, demography, occupational structure, and infrastructure of the country. Now, I would like to conclude your chapter, and I would say that when India got its independence after the 200 years of British colonial rule, some points that would really describe the economic underdevelopment during the British rule are the per capita income. It was constant over the long period. People dependent on agriculture remained dependent throughout the rule. The zamindari system, major setback. People used only traditional methods for cultivation. There were situations of famines, high famines situation in the country. Nothing was done to solve such situation. During the British rule, there was complete destruction of the Indian handicrafts industry. There was such an insignificant industrialization in the country that whatever development was there, it was the effort of individuals, but not that of the government. Government remained numb and they paid no attention towards the any kind of development of the Indian economy. Hostile policy of British government, it led to complete ruin of the Indian economy. So this is the end of your chapter. Hope you find this video interesting also, and maybe you're able to understand it well as well. Go through these notes, and along with this you go through the PDF for your solutions to NCERT, which is given along with this PDF. Best of luck, boys. Study well.